Welcome, everyone. My name is David Quinto-Pozos. I'm in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm joined by my colleague, Kamil Deen from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And you're also seeing an interpreter on the screen. This is Audrey, ASL English interpreter. And once someone else comes on, you'll see Taylor, and the two will probably be switching back and forth. So again, we apologize for being slightly delayed. We were working on some tech issues. This webinar is being recorded, and we ask you to not show your video right now because we're hoping to maximize essentially maximize the real estate for the video recording and ensure that the slides are as large as possible and that the interpreter is as large as possible as well. So with that, welcome, and I'm going to turn this over to Kamil.
Thank you, David. As David said, my name is Kamil Deen. I'm from the Department of Linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And we are running this abstract writing webinar for the Linguistics Society of America. David and I are co-chairs of the program committee, which means we're in charge of running the 2025 LSA Annual Meeting. And this is intended to try to maximize your participation in that annual meeting. And so we're very happy that you're here. Let me show you what we're going to be doing. Sorry, just one more thing. Let me just reiterate what David said. Please turn off your video if you haven't done so already. And then at the end of this, we're going to have a question discussion section. And during that, you're free to switch on your video if you like, or you don't need to. But for now, we're just going to go through our slides. If anyone has any questions while we're making our presentation, I'd encourage you to unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can save it for that question discussion period, which will happen at the end of this one of question and discussion, if you have any questions. So here's our plan for today. We're going to do some introductions just of me and David. I just want to tell you what our particular specialties are so that you know the direction that we're coming to linguistics from. We're then going to talk about what an abstract is just generally, and we'll talk about the general structure of abstracts. The LSA has certain requirements, and we're going to focus on the LSA requirements, which require 1 page of text with an optional 2nd page of examples, figures, tables, etc. So we're going to split the presentation into those 2 sections. I'll talk about the first page, what you put onto the first page of the abstract, and David will talk about the 2nd page, what goes onto the 2nd page of the abstract. And we're going to give you some general tips and ideas on how to structure an abstract, what kind of content goes into it, what the formatting should look like, what will work best for abstract reviewers, because that's your goal. Your goal is to be read well by your reviewers and then scored well by your reviewers. We'll then finish with a couple of extra resources that are available to you beyond just this webinar, which will help you write your abstract. And then we'll go into our questions and discussion section. So introductions, we had a couple of quick introductions at the beginning. So my name is Kamil Deen. As I said, I'm in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. My area of expertise is child language acquisition. I teach courses on first language acquisition, heritage language acquisition, bilingualism. I'm a generativist by training, but I'm not like a hardcore generativist, I don't think. And I am interested also in language revitalization and endangered languages. So how the study of child language applies to language revitalization. My abstracts tend to be very experimental in orientation, but we're going to try to give you different approaches to writing abstracts. I could ask David to do an introduction for himself, and then we'll get into the abstracts. David?
Sure. So my name is David Quinto-Pozos. For those of you who are ASL signers, this is my sign name. And I am at the University of Texas at Austin. My research is on sign languages, mostly American Sign Language, but I've also worked on Mexican Sign Language and Brazilian Sign Language. And I have several different areas of interest. Early on, I worked on language contact between Mexican Sign Language and American Sign Language. But after that, I started working on really interesting questions about the interaction of gesture and language in sign language, because there's a lot of gesture use as well. There's a lot of enactment. And so I work on something called constructed action in sign. Apologies, that's my phone. But I also work on child language acquisition, mostly focused on school-aged learning of ASL. There are lots of deaf kids who aren't exposed to ASL early, and so we're looking at their acquisition, when they're 4, 5, 6, or beyond, and with a particular focus on challenges with acquisition, so language disorder in sign. I have also worked on sign language change. We have a project that has been funded by the NSF, trying to apply the comparative method. I've worked on sign language interpretation and, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So I kind of have several interests. The reason I bring all of that up is because some of my abstracts, like Kamal mentioned earlier, some of my abstracts are somewhat experimental in nature because what we do is that we come up with, the kinds of tasks that you would run in a lab, and then you have to run those tasks and then you run statistics and so on and so forth. But then some of my abstracts are not that. They're more kind of, looking at language samples or describing, in some cases interpretation. So you'll get, our perspectives having had experience in a number of different areas, I think, and hopefully that'll be useful to you. So I'll turn it back to Kamal and we'll keep going with the content.
Okay, thanks, David. So what we're going to talk about today is the general structure of what an abstract is. And this is not intended to be a high-level webinar. So we're not going to give you detailed instructions on how to construct an abstract, but we will give you some, what I think are very useful organizational principles for how an abstract should be. And hopefully that will lead to a well-written abstract for you. So what is an abstract overall? Well, it's basically a brief summary of a presentation that you plan to make at the LSA in this case. It's a concise explanation of what you did as part of your project, why you did it, how you did it, and who you did it with, what did you find out. It's basically the key elements of the project that you are hoping to present to the field of linguistics. For the LSA, the abstract needs to be no more than 500 words in length. And you may think, oh, that's a lot of words. It actually isn't. One of the biggest challenges in writing an abstract is condensing all of the things that you want to say into a mere 500 words. And it really needs to be done in a very particular format. So you can't just write 500 words and send it off. It needs to be done in a very particular way, and that's because reviewers expect a very particular format. And if you deviate from that format, reviewers will just get confused. And so what your job should be in writing an abstract is trying to conform to these expectations so that when a reviewer reads the abstract, they don't have to put any extra thought into it. It's as easy for them as you can possibly make it. That's what you should be trying to do. So the way that the LSA requires it, at least this year, is that you have 2 pages in your abstract, or you must have at least 1 page, but you can have a second page if you so need it. The first page is where the entirety of your text appears. You can't have any prose on the second page. It needs to be on the first page. That's where you put your 500-word abstract. It must fit onto an 8.5 by 11-inch page or an A4 page. You have to have no more than a 1/2-inch margin with a 10-point font. I'd recommend you keep your font exactly the same all the way through your abstract. Switching fonts can be confusing. So basically, it's 500 words on 1 page. That's what you need to do. And that isn't a challenge. 500 words will easily fit onto 1 page, but that's what the expectation is for the LSA abstracts. The second page is where you can have all your additional information, things like linguistic examples, various figures and plots that you might need to present your data, tables that you might need to present your data in, statistical models that you want to add, references, etc. And that second page does not count towards your 500-word limit. So the 500-word limit is just the prose that you put on page 1. So I'd highly recommend that you don't put examples on page 1, because those tend to take up a lot of words, especially if the examples are from another language, because when you do examples in a language other than English, You need to provide a second line of gloss and a third line of translation. And all of that, one example could take, 100 words if it's a long example. So put all your examples on page 2 and number them, and then you can reference them within the 500-word text that you have. That way you can save words. We'll show you what this looks like in just a minute. And the last point about the format is you really don't want to be creative in the formatting. You want to follow these rules very, very carefully because, as I said earlier, these are the expectations that reviewers have. And so if you deviate from that, then it'll make your reviewers confused, and that will then lead to a poorer score for you.
Kamil, could you hold on for just a second? I want to make sure that we have Taylor spotlighted. I'm not seeing her on my
Okay.
view.
I actually see Taylor on my view.
Oh,
I'm seeing
I
Audrey because her camera's off, but I can see Taylor. Yeah.
I I cannot for some reason. Why is that? Let me see. It might be that it's taking him 2 minutes to play. Let me remove my spotlight. I still don't see Taylor. I just want to make sure that we have, there we go. Now I see Taylor
Okay.
spotlighted. Great. Taylor, okay, good. I'm dropping out and that'll give more. Let me do this. I'm going to drop out so that'll give more space for the two of you. And Kamal, do you mind just repeating the last thing you said? Because I don't know that if it got interpreted. Can you remember what that was?
Yeah. So the last point was that uh, creativity in formatting is generally a bad thing. You want to follow the guidelines that we're laying out here as carefully as you can, because if you deviate from the expected format, it's going to confuse your reviewers, at least momentarily, and that usually leads to poorer scores. People think that you don't quite know what you're doing if you don't follow these formatting requirements. Okay, so this is what an abstract typically looks like, and I'm going to show you what it looks like visually in just a moment. I just want to have these 7 points here. So you need to have a title at the top with no author because the abstract needs to be anonymous. At the beginning, you want to state what the problem is or your research question, what the point is of this project. You tell them that at the very beginning. You don't tell them that at the end or in the middle. You tell them at the very beginning what it is, what the very core point of your project is, what you found effectively. You want to state what your research, what the problem is that you're addressing. You then want to tell us something about the methods or your analysis or the way that you gathered data. You then report the data, you give us your results and you summarize your findings, and then you give us some contextualization of why this is important. You connect it to the literature in the field. Okay, that's the general structure. We're going to go through this in a little bit more detail right now. So this is what an abstract should look like. So me as a reviewer, when I open up an abstract and I'm supposed to be reviewing this, this is what I'm expecting to see. Okay, so at the top is some sort of title, and then it's organized into paragraphs. It's usually, 4 or 5, maybe 6 paragraphs, no more than that. But if it doesn't look like this, that's my first clue that this may not be a great abstract. So if you can follow this general visual cue, that'll get you past the first hurdle. For your title, you want your title to be informative. Unless you're a really big name in the field, I wouldn't try to be too cute with the title. Don't try to be too fancy with the title. Just make it informative and direct, right? So say something about exactly what you're doing so that the reader looks at it and says, oh, okay, now I can switch my mind into that mode. That'll make reading the rest of the abstract a little bit easier. You'll see, and I hope you can see my cursor, but all the way at the bottom here, there is this little blurb here, which basically is a word count. And I'll show you, we'll talk more about that later. So your title needs to be clear. I would center the title just because that's visually easier to follow. You want to have clear paragraph structure all the way through your abstract. This is one format, one way of doing it. I'll show you another one in just a moment, but this is the most common way of doing it, I think. At the end, you've got the word count. Like I said earlier, you want to have a consistent font and a consistent font size. If you switch fonts or you switch font size, it's distracting and it doesn't really help you. You may think it's going to add emphasis, but it actually ends up just being distractive. So just keep everything consistent all the way through. You want to have proper margins. Don't try to shorten the margins or anything. People will notice that, believe it or not. People do have eagle eyes, especially when you're a reviewer and you get 20 abstracts that you have to review one after the other. You can see these differences very, very quickly and very easily. So here's an important point about writing an abstract. When I'm reviewing abstracts, I expect something like a thesis statement at the very beginning of the abstract. What I want is that first sentence to tell me exactly what this abstract is going to do. And I'll give you some examples in just a moment of what a thesis statement looks like. But in my experience, beginner abstract writers struggle the most with this point, with being able to come right out and say at the very beginning, this is what I did, and this is why you should care. It's a very unnatural thing to write. Usually, you're taught to start with a soft opening, and then you gradually build up to your point, and then you give us some more information. That's not how abstracts work. Abstracts require that you tell us at the very beginning or near the beginning, this is the point of why you're reading this abstract, and the rest of this abstract is just going to tell you the details of this. So I call that the thesis statement. You put that at the very beginning. What you could do is you could put it at the end of the first paragraph, but I wouldn't put it any further than that. I would put my thesis statement really early in the abstract. And when I teach my students, I tell them, make it the first sentence, right? I just say, just do that. That's safe. That's what you should do. If it comes here, like in the middle of the abstract, I think you're going to struggle. Reviewers, they're going to be confused up until that point. They're going to expect, they're going to be thinking, what is this about? Why doesn't the writer just tell me what this is about? Why is the writer making me read all this information before I know what the abstract is about? So they really want that thesis statement early in the abstract. So your thesis statement could be something like this. So in this paper, we show X. Whatever the point of your abstract is, you put it there in one sentence. Right? It could be that simple. It could be slightly more embellished. So you could say, you could actually open your abstract with this kind of sentence. We provide evidence that, for example, children acquire some structure like the passive by age whatever, contrary to some references. That could be your opening sentence in an abstract. And that's just fine. There's no problem with that at all. You could also make it a little bit more embellished. So this is a much lengthier kind of opening statement for your abstract. The first sentence is kind of contextualizing the abstract. And then the second and third sentences are the thesis statement, right? But that would be the opening paragraph. So this would be a little bit like putting the thesis statement something a little bit further deeper in that opening paragraph. But you'll notice it's still very early in the overall abstract. That's still the first paragraph that we're dealing with here. Sorry, I think I want to show this. Sorry. So this is yet another example right here. We report on the results of a 2-year study on the language of X, where the language is the language that you're studying, showing that this language is interesting for a variety of reasons, right? So this would be more like a descriptive abstract rather than an experimental abstract, where let's say you are studying a language that has been understudied and you're trying to report on certain properties of that language. It could be this sort of opening sentence that you have for your abstract. That's what I would expect for that kind of study. So that's the opening paragraph. It's telling us what the point of this abstract is. So you tell us the point at the very beginning. In the second paragraph, typically, you tell us why we should care about that. So here you'll include your references effectively. It's like a literature review in paragraph 2. So you want to tell us what the point is, then you want to tell us why we should care, why the field of linguistics is interested in this. Some sort of literature review, you can set up some sort of puzzle, that there's a puzzle in the literature that we need to address. And if the reviewer is reading your abstract correctly, and if you've written your abstract well, they should see the link between paragraph 2 and paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 will tell us what you found. And paragraph 2 will tell us, oh, that's the puzzle that's being addressed. That's why the thesis statement is so important, because it tells us how to interpret paragraph 2. If a puzzle is not appropriate to your study, not everything involves puzzles, it might be something just descriptive. You want to describe in paragraph 2 what the gap is in the literature that you're filling. Paragraph 3 is typically the how paragraph. So this will be your experimental methods, or the field site that you went to, or the instrument that you used in the field to collect data, or if you're doing an intervention study in a school study, for example, what the intervention instrument was. It's the methods and the way that you gathered your data. You may also put your data there if you want. You want to be somewhat succinct. Oh, I'm sorry. Did my web page just reload? Yeah, it just reloaded. I'm going to have to restart the presentation. Sorry, this is using a web-based version of PowerPoint. And I'm just going to progress through to where we were. I think we were in paragraph 3. There we go. Okay. So you need to be somewhat succinct. So you can't give every detail about your methodology. You just need to tell us the key details. So what the overall method was, what the materials were that you used, if you're doing an experiment, the number of items and the control and filler items, your participants, who they were, their ages, that kind of stuff is what the reviewer is looking for. You could include the results here. That's what I mean by data here. You could include the results, or the results could go on page 2. I would recommend you put the results on page 2. It saves a lot of words, but it sort of depends on the nature of your data. The results could go here if you have the space, or it could go on page 2. But crucially, you want to tell us what it all means. You want to give us some sort of summary and the crucial point that your data makes for the field of linguistics or the particular research question that you have. Be direct about this. Don't beat around the bush. Just tell us, here's why this is important to linguists in the world. You can also, yeah, you want to connect it back to the puzzle that you set up, or the gap that you established in paragraph 2. Oh, come on. Seriously? Sorry. That's frustrating. I was trying to download this presentation earlier, but unfortunately I was unable to, so that's why I'm using the web-based version, but hopefully we'll get through this fairly effectively next. Give me just a moment. Okay. Okay. Here's a different format for the abstract. You'll notice that in this format, we've got subtitles for each of the paragraphs. That makes it easier to organize. It tells the reader exactly what you're dealing with. So some people prefer that. As you'll notice, though, it just takes up a few extra words. And very often when you're writing an abstract, you're working right up against that word limit. So those words, they may seem like few, but they end up being kind of crucial. But if you have the extra words, you can include these, and it makes the abstract much easier to read. Again, you still need to keep your thesis statement in that exact same position. Nobody wants to guess what the abstract is about. Let me just take a moment and explain the psychology of that. When you're reading as a reviewer, when you're reading 20 abstracts, when you pick up the next abstract, you want the writer to just tell you, here's what you're going to read. Here's what I'm doing, right? So you want to be spoon-fed what the exact point of this study is. Nobody wants to be guessing as they're reading all of these details. And the reviewer will say, if you don't give them the thesis statement, the reviewer will say to themselves, at least I will say to myself, just tell me what the point is. Why are you giving me all this information when I don't know how to integrate that information? So you need to be direct with that thesis statement. I think I've probably said that point a few too many times at this point. We'll give the interpreters a moment break. You know what? Maybe we'll just use this format rather than having to go through presentation format, if that's okay, because I don't think we need any more animation. Sorry, my version is not loading. Do you happen to have your
I have
version?
I have the whole version on my computer, so if you want, I can share my screen.
That would be helpful if you
Okay,
could do that. Thanks. Yeah. Then we won't be dealing with this reload every time.
great. You want to go ahead and
Let me stop sharing. Yeah.
stop sharing. And
While David is doing that, does anybody happen to have any questions that they have at this point?
Okay, so you've got the PowerPoint version there. Can you see it?
Can, yes.
Okay, and you just tell me I'm going to advance over to where we left off, which
Okay.
was keep going.
Yeah, keep going. Okay, that's good. Okay, actually, we've sort of done most of this.
Okay.
Yeah, we can continue. We can continue.
Oh,
Okay.
so we're at the
Now
end.
it's over to you. Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, good.
Sorry, one last thing. The last point on your abstract should be a word count, and the word count and the title do not count towards the word count, if that makes sense. It's really just the body of the text on page one, which counts towards the word count. So you should, if you're using, say, Microsoft Word or some similar word processing for a program, you should highlight just that part of the abstract, do the word count, and then put that number into the word count. And I wouldn't fudge with that because reviewers are really good at that. I've often had students submit word counts that were incorrect, and I look at it and I can see them down for that. So you should be accurate with your word counts. Okay, I'll turn it over to you, David.
Okay, thank you, Kamal. So let me just I'm going to piggyback on a few things that Kamal said. One that, the 500 words max is for this first page of the abstract, right? Not counting the title and not counting where you indicate what the word count is, right? So just the text itself. He also mentioned that you can put results on the second page. You can if they're in a certain form, and if they're in the form of, say, a table or a figure or a graph, something that is more visual. But the prose of your results really should be in that first page, right? Towards the end of the abstract. Whatever you call out from this first page, whatever you say, okay, I've got a table one shows the data from this study. You want to make sure that you reference the table in the first page, even though it's going to be on the second page. So you don't want your reviewer to look at the second page and say, oh, there's some tables that they never talked about on page one. You want to have talked about them, at least mention them and say what kind of information is in those tables. And if you can manage, interpret the table for your reader, right? You don't want your table to have to spend, excuse me, your reader to have to spend a lot of time going through all the data in a table, trying to understand what interpretation you came to for your study. So really, the first page is important because it has all those points that Kamal was talking about, but it has the essentially the roadmap to page two. So think of page one needing to have little roadmap pieces in it to page two. So let me go to, how do I? Oh, it's going to there we go. So let's talk about page two in more detail. I just kind of wanted to preface the discussion with those points. So that's where you'll find figures like images that you think are important, visuals that visuals are really important, and they could enhance an abstract quite a bit. But again, you want to be able to mention them in the first page and say and tell the reader what it is that they're looking at. Tables with data, right? Examples, linguistic examples, which we often put in parentheses, like a number one in parentheses, a number two in parentheses. Some, you don't have to have the parentheses, but that's a common, say, we've used that traditionally in linguistics when we're calling out examples. As I mentioned earlier, you try to work in your interpretation of the visual information so on page one so that your reader isn't trying to make all those interpretations on their own. Obviously, some figures are, you know, can easy to interpret on their own. Some graphs are easy to interpret on their own, but you still want to be able to say some things about that on page one if you're able to. One mistake that many of my students often make, and I'm not calling out any of my current students, I'm just saying students over the years, is just that they may include a table or include a figure, include a graph, but forget to label it, right? What's the title of that figure? And they're important because that title gives the reader a very condensed bit of information about what they're going to be looking at in that figure or that graph or that table. You don't need to have the title in your page one. You can just call out to it, figure one, table one, whatever, but definitely have that title in the actual figure or the table. And I'm going to actually show you some examples in APA format. You don't have to use APA format, but that's one that I often suggest that my students use, and there's some good resources online for it. And I'll show you some examples online in just a second here. The titles for the figures, the tables, the graphs should be, manageable. It shouldn't be too long, and the captions shouldn't be too long. In other words, don't try to use up space on page two just because you ran out of space on page one, right? So try to get everything into page one that you need to say. That's the text of the body of the abstract, and then the supporting information on page two is just the titles and those kinds of things for your visuals. Those are not part of the word count. So don't worry about a title being part of the word count. It's only the page one stuff that's part of the word count. Common mistake, people forget to label their axes on graphs. It's good to know what your x-axis, what your y-axis is, what x-axis is. If you have a z-axis, whatever, make sure that those are labeled. It really helps the reader understand what it is that they're looking at. And I think I've already said the last point. So I'm gonna actually exit out of this, and I'm gonna show you a bit of examples. So I'm actually going to share. We're going to go on for about another 5 minutes here, and then we'll stop and go to question and answer. I'm just going to show you two quick things here about visuals. And let me get I'm going to share my whole second desktop. And let's remove this. So hopefully you should be seeing a desktop, a few things on here. So
Yeah,
as I
we're
mentioned,
seeing.
yeah, great. As I mentioned, APA is a nice resource online. If you just do a Google search, you'll find APA style. And here's an example of a table setup. And notice that they've got a really nice example here with this table happens to take up pretty much one whole page, right? With the table itself and with notes for the table, but your tables can be much smaller than this. You could also make a table, and it still has to be, you know, readable. So the font on the table shouldn't be less than the 10-point font that you have on page one. But as long as it's that, minimally, then you're fine, and your tables can be smaller. But here's an example of a table with all the pieces of the table, right? The table number, the title of the table, how you label columns, and even including how you do notes. APA is really nice about giving you all the details. Here's a figure set up in APA format. Again, a figure number, a figure title, and as I mentioned, those labeling of axes that I said are so important, right? So we know that on this axis we have work attitude, and on this axis it's time of day, and those types of information, that's really important for your reader. And there's a table note here. This might be much more self-explanatory, but if you're able to call out to that on page one and can basically summarize it in a sentence, that would be really, really useful. So you can always look at APA style guide online. There are other style guides online. We don't, for the LSA, require any one particular style sheet other than the guidelines that we give you about, minimum font size, minimum margin size, which was shared earlier by Kamil, and then the number of words. But what I would suggest is that pick a style that's a typical style like APA or MLA, Chicago Manual style, and just follow that throughout, right? Your second page is also your page for references. So you can have your references list on your second page, any tables, any figures, any graphs, all of that you can reserve for the second page and not have to use up that really important real estate that you have on page one. We're going to be sharing the call for papers for the regular paper presentations at the LSA very soon here, and you'll see more details there, some of which will overlap with what we've talked about today, but that should be coming out very soon here, and then that'll answer more of your questions. I think that I will basically stop now. When we share the slides with you, there'll be a final page that has a resource to let's see, if you look at the LSA website, they have under their events tab, if you click on events and you can see the annual meeting, You can see a number of options that you can pick, including some model abstracts. So everything that, say, Kamil just shared with you and I've shared with you, you can see in some real abstracts that were created on certain topics. And then there's an older webinar that was done on abstract writing that is currently linked to, but we'll probably add today's webinar here, and that'll be added to this page as well. And this is where you'll find the call for papers when that's all ready to go. So we have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to stop sharing here, and I will open it up at this point for questions from attendees. If you've got questions for us, please let us know. If you want to have your video on when you ask the question, please do that. You can also ask a question in the chat window.
Yeah, so while people gather the courage to ask a question, let me address a question that was, or a point that was submitted when you registered. Somebody said that one thing that they want to learn is how to write an abstract for any conference. And I think what David and I just went through basically applies to any conference. It was tailored for the LSA annual meeting, but these principles apply to all conferences. Someone else said that they want to learn how to write an abstract for a dissertation chapter. And there's no difference between a dissertation chapter and any other project, so long as the content of that dissertation chapter is sort of a self-encapsulated project, that it kind of makes sense by itself, that you can wrap it into a single project, then nobody needs to know that it's a dissertation chapter. It's a project by itself. From Mariam.
Yeah, and also there was a question in the chat from Shabnam, and let me respond to that first,
Okay.
and then we can take the second question from Miriam. So Shabnam, I saw your question. Typically, a review paper that you do, say, like you're reviewing literature on a certain topic. Let me actually spotlight myself because I think I removed myself earlier. Typically, if you're, say, writing a paper for a class, right, and it's a literature review of some sort, that may not be the most, say, appropriate submission for an abstract unless you have some sort of analysis that you want to offer based on your review of the literature, right? So suppose your review of the literature is that, boy, everybody is overlooking something that's really important, and you have a good argument for why they're overlooking it, right? So really your abstract is about that argument for why they're overlooking it, as opposed to the abstract being a review of the literature, right? So typically at a conference like the LSA or other conferences, we're looking for the kinds of presentations and posters that are essentially novel work, right? Some of it is data driven so that you've collected data. Some of it is some novel analysis, but it has to have that characteristic of being novel. And so hopefully that'll help.
Yeah. Just one other thing, it may be that a systematic review, what you meant by that was like a meta-analysis. And what David is saying, a meta-analysis is review. That is novel, and that's well worth submitting to. Let's do Mariam. Did Mariam disappear?
Maybe.
Mariam, do you have a question? If not, let's give her a moment to unmute herself. Mariam, do you have a question?
Okay,
Oh,
so
she can't connect. Why don't you try to fix that while we go to Acosta? Acosta, could you unmute yourself and ask your question?
for Felipe, yeah.
Yeah, I have two questions. First question is there only one round of selection for abstracts, or do you do multiple rounds for that? That's first question. Second question is regarding the application opening and the deadline. Is that defined as of this moment?
Yeah, so the first question about how the review happens, what we do is we collect all the abstracts that are submitted by the deadline. We then separate them into batches, which we send to our various reviewers. So we look at our reviewers and the expertise of that reviewer, and we give them abstracts that are matched to their expertise. They will then read them and score them and submit their scores back to us. And then we rank abstracts based upon those numbers. And then we select the top batch to be oral presentations at the LSA annual meeting. And then the next batch below that are for poster presentations with just one note. I'll come back to that in a second. Yeah. And then there are some alternates where if somebody can't, if we offer a position to someone and they can't accept it, then we go to the alternates, and then everyone else is rejected. But we don't then do a second round of review. So it's just a single round of review. I'm sort of trying to get at your question. The question of whether you end up being a talk or a poster is something that you actually have some power over when you submit your abstract. We will ask you whether you want to be considered for a talk, whether you want to be considered for a poster, or whether you want to be considered for both, or I guess neither means you're not going to make a presentation. But if you select that you only want to be considered for a talk, it means that your abstract needs to be reviewed really well, otherwise you'll be rejected. But if you don't mind if it's a talk or a poster, that gives you some more latitude, because if your abstract is ranked in that second tier, then we'll offer you a poster position, but we won't reject you from the talk option.
Yeah.
David, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, let me just add one thing. There are some types of work that really the poster format is actually better than the talk format. And in that case, it's not really just about a ranking of, say, that talks are better than posters. It's not that at all. It's just that posters can be very highly competitive as well. And so if somebody indicates they want just to be, considered for a poster, then that's what they'll be considered for. But it doesn't mean that it's, any less, say, rigorous than a talk, because some things are better suited for posters. Some people like to give poster presentations anyway, because they like the interaction that you get in a poster session that you don't get when you're giving a stage presentation. So yeah, keep that in mind, but you have the power to do that. We'll be releasing the call soon. Your second question, Felipe, was about when they'll be due. It looks like, and we need to finalize this, but it looks like we're going to have abstracts due at the end of June. So that means June 30th will be the deadline for submission, and that will be available pretty soon here on our website. So you're kind of hearing this first from us. Yeah.
Mariam asked, so Mariam, you were able to put your question into chat, asking whether we count the title of each paragraph in the word count. If you choose that format, then the answer is yes. The title of each paragraph does count towards the word count. But if you end up going over the word count because of those titles, what I would recommend is you delete those titles. Because if your paragraph structure follows the format that we talked about, the titles are really just additional clarification. The paragraph structure itself should be self-indicative of the organization of the abstract. So a well-written abstract doesn't need to have those individual paragraph titles, but it does count towards the word count.
Right. And so let's
Uh,
see, we've got Shabnam raised their hand.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for the great presentation. I really enjoyed. And, I'm a first year PhD student here at University of Connecticut, and I'm studying speech, language, and hearing sciences. So my area of interest and research is mainly on bilingualism and language acquisition. So I have done previously some research, systematic review. So that's why I asked, because it was about neurolinguistic, it's bibliometric. So it's a very novel way that actually portrays the studies, from 1913 to 22. So that was one of my questions, whether I can submit that as an abstract, or can it also be a project, an ongoing project, but actually it has not been published yet. So I'm curious to know.
Right. So earlier, the question was also about meta-analyses, right? So when you do a meta-analysis, at least in one type of meta-analysis, is that you take a lots of studies that have been done in the past, and then you look at their statistics, right? And you
Right.
pull from their statistics, and then using a new design that is going to take all these statistics into account, you look at the variance across all these studies, right? Is that what you did?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so in that case, then what you're doing is that you're doing your own analysis of these other studies that have been done over time, right? And
Mhm.
that very much is a novel analysis, is what Kamal was saying earlier. And that could be submitted as a, for presentation, either poster or paper. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
And you asked whether it can be unpublished previously, and yes, absolutely. I mean, that's usually what you do. You start with a conference presentation, and then you seek publication in a journal. So the fact that your study has not been published is fine. I
Yeah,
would recommend, though, if you're doubtful about whether the content is appropriate for the LSA, I definitely recommend running it by your advisor before you submit.
absolutely. And
Uh-huh.
now that I think about it, I don't think we see too many of these types of meta-analyses that appear in conferences as presentations. That it may have happened in the past, but I think more often than not, you see them in published papers, right? A meta-analysis appears in a published paper. In this case, maybe the poster format is a good format for this because it allows you to also describe what you did and give the results of that meta-analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And will it be in person?
Yes, these are the meeting is in person this coming year.
Okay.
There's no virtual component to my knowledge.
And may I know the deadline? This is my last question.
Right, as we'll be releasing the official call soon, but it looks like what we're going to be working with is a June 30th deadline for abstract submission.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. I really
Sure.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Felipe, you have another question?
Yes, sir. Two more questions. Sorry. First question, again, it's regarding the subject of the potential abstracts. I understand there is a section for indigenous languages of the American Language Society. That's my area, basically. And would you be holding also in person, or is that integrated into this coming meeting, or that's completely separate? That's the first question. Yeah, the second question is regarding financial aid. Is there any financial aid for students traveling?
So for the first question, there is some integration with the sister societies, but the review for abstracts for that session will be done by those sister societies. So you said the American Indigenous Society, is that what you said? Indigenous Language Society?
Yeah, I'm not sure
Yeah.
of the acronym, but
Yeah.
that's
So
indigenous languages.
you would submit through them. They would then do their review. But then there's integration on the back end in that all of the accepted abstracts for their society will be shown on the LSA website, on the annual meeting website. So that's where the integration happens. But review for those abstracts are done through those different societies. And there's a bunch of them actually that will hold their meetings like the day before the LSA annual meeting, or some of them will happen during the LSA annual meeting, but they are run somewhat separately because they have their own particular priorities each different year. But the general principles of abstract writing are the same for their abstracts and for the LSA abstracts from other conference abstracts. They might have different word counts and that sort of thing, but all of the stuff that David and I talked about is basically the same there.
Right, but if I want to participate in both conferences, I can just submit as a regular applicant, right? I don't have to submit to one or the other, but I can submit both to the LSA and later to these other sister.
Oh, I don't know if you can.
You cannot submit, Felipe, you
Uh,
cannot submit the same abstract to both society, to more than one society. You can submit different abstracts, but you just can't do the same one.
and the reason for that is because if you get accepted to both, we don't want to have duplication of the exact same content within days of each other, right? Actually,
Right.
we don't want to have duplication even within months
Right.
or years of each other.
Right.
You should only present one time, yeah.
And you'll see that it's going to be in the instructions that's actually explicitly stated that you can't submit the same abstract to both the LSA and to a sister society. So, but if you have different abstract that you want to submit to them, you certainly can. Yeah. And
That
then the
makes sense.
second question you
Thank
asked, Felipe, was about support. And I was just looking on the LSA website, and I'm not finding that information right now. So again, one possibility is that we'll follow up on that and try to get back to you. The other possibility is that you could email either Kamil and myself. I mean, Kamil is at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm at the University of Texas. You'll be able to find us. And I did not include our email addresses, unfortunately, but I'll put mine in the chat.
Yeah, I'll put mine too.
And then you can reach out to me if you don't have that answered later. What I would suggest, though, Felipe, is to just send an email to the LSA and ask that question, because they're more aware of all the different resources that are available. So, and if you don't get the answer, then just let us know. I think we've reached the end of our time here. So unless there's any other questions, burning questions, we might wrap things up.
Yeah. Can I just invite all the participants here? If you do have any other follow-up questions, feel free to email me or David or both of us, and we can address your questions. If you are like Shabnam, where you're in a university setting right now, I would encourage you to work with your advisors if you're a student to help figure out some of the details of your abstracts. And the resources that David mentioned will be very, very helpful. We're going to put those in the video. The video will be made available on the LSA website, and you'll be able to see the extra resources that are available for abstract writing, including the LSA model abstracts and various YouTube videos on how to write linguistics abstracts. And so please take a look at those if you have any other questions.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And thanks to you, Kamil. Thank you, Taylor. And Audrey had to leave, so we really appreciate to have the interpretation support today.
Good luck, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you in Philadelphia in 2025.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Appreciate it.